In this video, I'm going to show you how to make white backgrounds in Photoshop. Hi, welcome back to the Photoshop training channel. I'm Jesus Ramirez. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create white backgrounds in Photoshop. You're going to learn a bunch of cool tips and tricks. We're going to start by learning how to remove a foreground from a background, and I'm going to show you how the Select and Mask Workspace works and how to better utilize it so that you get the best results. I'm also going to show you how to create light wraps in Photoshop to create better composites. And just like all my other tutorials, there's going to be a bunch of hidden gems, so stick around to the end. Okay, let's get started. We're going to work with this image, and our goal is to make a white background. So that's the first thing that I'll do. I'll go into the new adjustment layer icon and select solid color. Then I'll select white, press OK. You don't need to do this, but I'm going to delete the layer mask. I just want things to look a little cleaner, and I'll rename this layer to background. We always want to work non-destructively, so I'm just going to duplicate this original layer by pressing Ctrl-J, Command-J on the Mac, and I'm going to drag it up above the background that we just created. So we're just going to work with this original copy. In this original layer, I'll just disable it and keep it there in case we need it again later. I'll select the original copy, and now I'm going to make a selection so that I can extract the foreground, which is the model, from the background. One of the best ways of doing that is with the quick selection tool. If you're on Photoshop CS6 and older, you can just click and drag around your model to make a selection. But if you're in Photoshop CC 2018 or newer, you can go into the Select Subject button, which will use Adobe Sensei, Adobe's artificial intelligence, to make a selection around the main subject of the image. I'm going to press OK to discard the current selection, and Photoshop will analyze the image, and it will make a really good selection around my model. Now, this selection is not perfect, but it's a great starting point. I can click and drag and add to the selection. As you can see, some of these areas were not selected, and that's okay. I'm just going to click and drag and just make sure that everything that needs to be selected is selected. If you accidentally selected something that shouldn't be selected, like I just did here, you can hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and click and drag to subtract from the selection. And I'm not going to spend too much time fine-tuning the selection, but I would recommend that in your image you spend some time making sure that you have a good one. One trick that you can do is press the Q key on the keyboard to enter the quick mask mode, and you can see what the mask is selecting. Anything that is in red will not be selected. So for example, this area here, you can see that it's cutting into his arm. I'll zoom in. I can select our brush tool and paint with white. Make sure that white is your foreground color, and just paint in those pixels. So I'm painting in the pixels here, and I'm holding Shift as I click. So if you click and hold Shift, it'll make a straight line from the point that you clicked on to the second point that you clicked on. I'm going to undo that because I don't want to actually have that line there. But anyway, spend some time fine-tuning your selection. When you're done with your selection, you can press Q again. The selection will come back. I'm going to double click on a hand tool. Now we're going to use the Select and Mask Workspace. So I'm going to select the quick selection tool again and go into Select and Mask. If I click Select and Mask, it'll bring up the Select and Mask Workspace where we can adjust the selection. I'm going to cancel it for now. If you're in Photoshop CS6 or older, you do not have access to the Select and Mask Workspace, but you have the Refine Mask dialog box. Let me show you what that looks like. If you go into Select, hold Shift, and click on Select and Mask, it brings up the old Refine Edge or Refine Mask dialog box. So this is a way for you to use the old version of this tool if you prefer it. But if you're in an older version, of course, you don't have access to the new one, so you're stuck with this one. But everything that we're going to work with is in this Adjust Edge area, in this tool here where we can actually paint on the selection. So even though it looks different, the tools that I'm about to show you are actually in this dialog box as well. And by the way, let me know in the comments if you prefer the old dialog box over the new workspace. Also, if you like this trick, click on that like button now. But anyway, with that selection active, once again, I'm going to go into the Select and Mask Workspace. It's going to bring that up, and I can adjust my selection. For view, I have on white, which really doesn't matter because if I select onion skinning, it still looks the same way because the background is also white, the white that we're using, but I'll just leave it on white since that's what we really want anyway. So on white, and what I can do in this dialog box is control how the edge of the mask looks. So I can press Z to get the zoom tool, and then I can click to zoom in. And what I want to do is smooth the selection so I have a smooth edge. See how jagged the selection looks in some areas? I can just click and drag this to the right to smooth it. I can also add some contrast to make the darker pixels darker and the brighter pixels brighter, which makes a sharper edge. If I go into the black and white view, you can see what I mean by bright and dark pixels. So you can see that there. See that how we have some bright pixels here and some darker ones there? If I increase the contrast, it makes some darker, some lighter, and it creates a sharper edge. This is what's creating our mask. But anyway, I'm gonna go back to on white. I'm not worried about the hair for now, so we're gonna work with that later. I'm just looking at the sharper edges of the image. And by the way, I'm holding the space bar to pan across the image. I'm going to right click and select fit on screen. I'm not going to work on the hair now because if I start making adjustments to the hair, it's going to apply these global refinements. So for example, if I come in here and select the refine edge tool to refine the hair, and I'll explain how that works in a moment, notice that it doesn't really do a good job because Photoshop is also applying these settings and I don't want that. So I'm going to undo that by pressing Ctrl-Alt-Z, Command-Option-Z on the Mac. So I'm just going to press OK. And that updates the selection. And by the way, you might be asking yourself why it did not create a layer mask. And that's because in the Select and Mask Workspace, I have output to selection. So if I select output to layer mask, it'll create a layer mask. So that's what it will do next time I press OK. But anyway, notice what happens now with this tool, the Refine Edge. Compare it to the previous example. See how much better of a job it's doing of extracting the hair? That's because I don't have any of these global refinements applied. Now, I want to show you what this is doing behind the scenes. That way you understand and you can better adjust your image. So I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-Z, Command-Option-Z on the Mac to undo. What is this tool doing? If I click on Show Edges, nothing shows up, right? But if I increase the radius of the edge, you can see now that this is the edge where the refinement occurs, where Photoshop looks for hair and things like that to make an extraction. So if I increase the edge, it's going to look for more areas. If I click Smart Radius, notice how now I don't have an edge that is a 29 pixel width. Some areas are thinner, other areas are thicker. So that's what the Smart Radius does. It just changes the width on different areas depending on the content that you have. In this case, I don't want that. I don't want the Smart Radius, and I want to be able to paint my own edge. So I'm just going to bring the edge reduction down to 0. And actually, just for the purposes of demonstration, I'm just going to keep it here at 1 pixel so that we can barely see it. So with the Refine Edge tool, what I'm really doing is painting an edge. See how I just painted that edge there? That's what this tool does. It helps you redefine the edge detection area. So I'm going to uncheck Show Edge, and notice what it did there. It extracted the hair. So I'm going to continue painting on those areas to extract the hair. If I click on Show Edge, you can see what I did. All I did is just paint on these areas, and that's where Photoshop looks to make that adjustment. I'm going to bring the radius back to 0 because I do not want any adjustments down here. And again, just for the purposes of the demonstration, let me show you what happens when I increase the radius and uncheck Show Edge. See how it starts damaging the edges here in the shirt? I don't want any of that. So I'm just going to bring this back down to 0. And I just want Photoshop to focus on the areas that I painted on. So the hair up there. Anyway, so now that I've extracted the hair, now I can fine tune it with the regular brush tool. So with this brush, I can add some of the pixels that it hid here in the highlights of the hair. And I can subtract by clicking on this button and painting on these areas that have some darker pixels. And of course, you can spend a lot more time fine-tuning your mask, but in this case, this is going to be good enough. So that's all I really need. In some cases, you may need to make some more global adjustments. such as maybe shifting the edge just a little bit more, maybe adding a little bit more contrast or something like that. This time I'm outputting to a layer mask, so when I press OK, I get a layer mask. See, I've extracted the background. I'll enable the layer again, and you can always come in, select the brush tool, select white as your foreground color, and paint over the details that you lost to bring them back. And you can make black your foreground color and paint away these pixels next to his hair. Then select the burn tool, which darkens pixels. So you can paint with the burn tool on the mask to hide pixels that are already very dark so they become invisible. See how the layer mask has this white focus, this white outline? I'm painting on the layer mask with these tools. And again, you can always come in here and just fine tune it until you're happy. I'm not going to spend too much time fine tuning in this video, but of course, do it in your own image. I'm going to double click on the hand tool, and this is looking pretty good. What I'm going to do now is work on something called a light wrap. If you're familiar with video compositing, then you're probably familiar with light wraps, but if you're not, then I do have a tutorial where I go into detail about what light wraps are, how they work, and I'll place a link to that video down below in the description. But simply explain, they're just layers that you create to simulate light hitting a subject on a scene. So you can create them in many different ways. The way that I'm going to create them in this tutorial is by double clicking on the side of the layer and clicking on inner shadow. And I know this is a shadow, but we're not going to create a shadow. Even though the label says shadow, glow, or whatever, it doesn't really matter. You can use it for whatever you want. So instead of a shadow, I'm going to use it for a glow. So I'm going to click and drag. You see how I'm clicking and dragging and you can see that shadow? Well, I'm going to use that as a glow. If this were really a studio with a white background, he would have a lot more light bouncing off of him, a lot of white light. So I'm trying to simulate that with this effect. So with this inner shadow selected, I'm going to change the color to white, the blending mode to overlay. Notice how I now have this bright highlight behind them. And I can increase the opacity. I'm going to increase it to 100% so that we can better see it, and then we'll reduce it. I'm going to increase the size, and I can just click and drag and try to figure out where the light would really be coming from. So clearly the right side of his face is brighter, so the light's coming from the right. So I'll try to duplicate that with this light wrap. Then I can just decrease the opacity, and that looks pretty good. I'm going to click on this plus icon to get a second light wrap. Now, if you don't have Photoshop CC, you will not be able to duplicate this shadow, but watch what I do in the next step and then you'll get an idea of how to duplicate it. But anyway, with Photoshop CC, you can just click and drag this second shadow, but make sure that you uncheck global light. So then I can just move this one independently from the first shadow. So I'm just trying to create just a brighter shadow, like right on top above his shoulders, like right here and right here. And I'll probably set the angle to 90 just to make sure that the light is coming from right above. And I can reduce the opacity to 0 and just increase it ever so slightly just to get a little bit more of a highlight on top. Then I'll press OK. If I right click on the FX icon and select Create Layers, those layer styles now become layers. These layers are clipped to the original copy. That's what this down pointing arrow is indicating, that the visibility of this layer is controlling the visibility of the clip layers above. If I select the Move tool, I can click and drag and move them around anywhere I want. So I'm going to undo that because I was happy with the placement. Now, earlier I said that if you were in Photoshop CS6, there was an alternative to duplicating the inner shadow. Well, this is it. Convert your layer style into a layer and then press Ctrl-J, Command-J to duplicate, and you'll have another copy of that highlight, and you can move it around anywhere that you like. Now, the reason that I converted them into layers is so that I could add layer mask to both these layers and paint with black in areas where I don't want to apply the highlight. So notice how much the highlight is affecting his ear, his jaw, and his neck. I really don't want that. So I'm just going to select the brush tool, increase the size of my brush with the right bracket key on the keyboard, and paint with black to hide the highlight in those areas. And you can see the result there. And this second highlight's okay, so I'll just leave it there. And that's all you really need to do. So that's before and after the light wrap. What I'll do now is add a shadow. If you remember, the original image had a shadow. Now you can paint your own shadows from scratch, but if you can, try to use the shadow from the original photo because it'll look more realistic. And that's what I'll do. I'll select the original layer, press Ctrl J, Command J on the Mac, drag it up, and I'll just call this layer shadow. I like to name my layers so that I know what they control. And to that point, I'll also rename these layers. Light wrap 1 and light wrap 2. And this is the original copy. We know what that is. Okay, so now we're going to turn this into a shadow. First, I'm going to remove the color. So you can press Ctrl-Shift-U to desaturate a layer. Then I'm going to go into Image, Adjustment, Levels, and drag the white point to the left to brighten up the image. And I'm only looking at the shadow. That's what I'm really concerned about. So I'm just making adjustments so that I mainly have the shadow. So these adjustments seem to work. I'll press OK. Then I'll go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'll blur it as much as I need to so that I don't see the detail in the wall. Maybe about 10 pixels. Then press OK. Hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and click on the layer mask icon to create a black layer mask that hides everything in the layer. I'll enable all my layers, and by the way, if you click on an eye icon and drag down, you can disable them or enable them. So I'm enabling all my layers again. I'll enable the background as well. And what I'll do now is paint with white on this shadow layer to reveal the shadow. And now it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay. We're going to fix it. I'm going to increase the size of my brush by tapping on the right bracket key on the keyboard. And I'm just painting my shadow in like so. Then I'm going to click on the Move tool and use the arrow keys on the keyboard to move it to the right and move it down just a little bit so that we don't see those edges. If there's areas like in his ear here where we have edges, I can just click on the smudge tool, make sure that Sample All Layers is unchecked, and then just smudge those areas in. But make sure that you smudge them on the actual layer. So make sure that the focus, this white outline, is on the layer thumbnail and not on the layer mask. So just smudge those pixels in like so in all these different areas. Then I can reduce the opacity of that shadow. So I'll keep it very light, maybe something like that. So that's before and after. I'll finalize this effect by clicking on top of the light wrap, creating a new layer, clip it to the layers below so that they only affect the original copy. You can do so by pressing Ctrl-Alt-G, Command-Option-G on the Mac, and I'll call this layer Dodge and Burn. And I'm going to hold Shift, then press the backspace key, that's the delete key on the Mac, and select 50% gray from the contents and press OK. That creates a 50% gray layer. Then I'm going to change the blending mode to soft light, and I'm going to use the dodge and burn tools to emphasize the highlights in the image and also the shadows. So I'll select the dodge tool first, and I can just think of where I would see highlights more prominently if this were a brighter room, so maybe in these areas here. And of course, I'm exaggerating the effect a bit so that it's noticeable for the tutorial. I'm also going fairly quickly here. You want to take your time when you're doing this. And I'm only working on the shirt, by the way. And I know it might not be obvious now, but when I click on the eye icon, you'll see how this is affecting the layer. Then I can select the burn tool. And now I can work on the shadows, make some shadows deeper to create more contrast between shadows and highlights and shape the shirt a bit better. You'll notice that I'm not really working on his face. I like to have my dodge and burn layers in separate layers so that I can control each individual element. So this layer controls the shirt. I'll change the blending mode back to normal so that you can see what I really did. Just make some areas brighter, other areas darker. And by the way, you could also use the overlay blending mode. It gives you a slightly different result. So check it out. You can also reduce the opacity. And that's the before and after. Then I'll create a new layer and clip it to the layers below by pressing Ctrl-Alt-G, Command-Option-G on the Mac, and also fill it with 50% gray. So Shift and Backspace, select 50% gray, and press OK. And I'll also call this layer Dodge and Burn. I'll also add the word face to it so that I know it's controlling the face. Change the blending mode to soft light. Then with the burn tool selected, you can increase the shadows on his face, his eyebrows, his hair, and anywhere that you like. Then select the dodge tool and you can work on the highlights of his face. And again, spend more time on your image. For this tutorial, I'm not going to spend too much time with this step. That's before and after. And I can bring down the opacity just to fine tune it. With this dodge and burn layer selected, I'm going to hold Shift and click on the background to select all the layers in between. Then I can press Ctrl-G, Command-G on the Mac to put that into a group. I'll call the group White Background. And this is my result. Of course, in your image, you're going to have to spend a little more time fine-tuning things. There might be a few differences, but if you follow these steps, it should get you most of the way there. And by the way, since this video was all about compositing, I recommend watching my last video on how to color match using curves. It's a 90-second tutorial, so you can watch it right after this. I'll place a link right below in the description. If you decide to create anything using this tutorial or any other of my tutorials, don't forget to share it on Instagram with the hashtag PTCVids. Also, don't forget to subscribe and to click on that notification button. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again at the next tutorial.